red dot has appeared, you might have a small message come up on the screen as well, just to confirm that we are recording the webinar today. And the purpose of that is for those people that aren't able to make today's session, but also we will send you the link to the recording, so you'll be able to play it back, pause it, rewind it, share it with colleagues. But by being here today, we will make sure that you get the link to the recording sent to you. So officially, let me welcome you to this webinar as part of the Learning Futures Gamification CPD module. The screen that we're using, you can see a number of features that I just want to draw your attention to, a little bit of housekeeping. Up at the top where you've also got your speaker icon, there should be an icon of somebody raising their hand, and if you click on the drop down arrow at the end of there, it says show status, and you can see that you can applause, you can put laughter, and those icons just go at the end of your name on the attendees box. If you do want to use any of those, please feel free, but you will need to clear the status at the end of that just to turn them off as well. Throughout the presentation or the webinar today, please feel free to use the chat area. Any comments, anything that you want going over again, or if you've got specific questions, there will be an opportunity that we'll pause through the webinar, but also at the end of the main presentation to take any questions as well. We are reliant on our internet connection here. Touch wood, everything's been fine so far, but if you find suddenly that you can't hear and you think, hang on a minute, what's going on, and the screen looks as if it's frozen, then it may well be that your internet connection has kicked you out of this meeting room. What we'd ask you to do is just to close down your internet browser and come back into the meeting room with the link that was sent to you. It takes about a minute to come back in, and we'll just pick up from where you were. If one of the speakers, if that happens to any of the speakers, then we will make sure that we've got people here that we will cover, and again it will just take about 60 seconds for that person to be able to come back into the room. But as I say, touch wood, not happened so far. We've done a quick audio check, and as I say, there is a drop down arrow at the end of the loudspeaker. If you want it a little bit louder and your system's not able to do that, then use the drop down arrow at the end of the speaker, and that will make it a little bit louder for you. We are very fortunate today to have with us a brilliant speaker, Paul Ladley from Pixel Fountain. Paul, if you'd like to say hello.
Hi everyone.
Brilliant, thank you, Paul. I'm going to ask Paul to introduce himself in a moment, but we're absolutely delighted that many of you may well know Paul. If you have an insight into gamification, then Paul works a lot within the sector and is well known within the sector. So we're absolutely delighted that Paul's been able to join us here today. But before I ask Paul to give his input, just going to draw your attention to the process within the CPD framework. So the thinking behind this is that we'll have an expert input, and that will help us share some of the best practice, may well challenge some of our thinking and ideas and raise awareness to other points. But that's really as a taster. We're not giving the experts too long to give an input, so the idea is that they're going to raise some awareness. What we then will do is, after Paul's input, I'm going to show you some of the online resources that we've put together and also a CPD activity. And we'd ask that if you find any of that useful and you say, yeah, well, I want to do more about this and start to apply this back into your own organisation, that you use the Learning Futures site to share how that goes. So anything that you create or any experience that you have that you use the CPD module, we'd ask that you share, and I'll show you how to do that at the end. You may well be aware that this webinar today, as I say, is part of the gamification module, and there's a number of modules available to you. They're all free of charge. Some of them, the webinar has already happened and there's a recording available. Others are still yet to happen, so you'll be able to book onto any of those webinars as you wish, all through the Learning Futures site. So the agenda for today is, I'm going to ask Paul to introduce himself in a second. There will be an opportunity for questions and answers, and then I'm going to run through the supporting resources and the CPD activity. So without any further ado, what I'm going to do is stop sharing these slides. Paul, I'm just going to load your slides whilst I'm here. And let's have a look. Make sure. Ones. Okay, there should be some slides loading on your screen now. Yeah, I can just see that they've come up. Okay, Paul, I'm going to hand over to you and ask if you'd like to give your input, please.
Okay, Rob, I can't see anything at my end. Oh, hang on, I think it's coming. gone black.
Okay. Okay, I can see that the slides are loaded. Paul, any good?
I've just got a black screen with a square dot in it.
All right. Okay, that hasn't started very well then. What I'm going to do, I'm going to stop sharing those slides for a second then, Paul. Paul, do you want to do that from your end? So if you want to share that document, we'll try that from your end. Okay, I can just see something loading now.
Well, I've got it on my screen. Has everyone got it on their screen?
I can see that on my screen. Yep, absolutely fine. So Tim, thank you for confirming that. Okay, I'm going to turn my microphone off and hand over to you, Paul.
Brilliant. Okay. Hopefully I don't waffle on too long in this one. I do have a tendency to waffle during presentations, but anyway, let's go ahead with this one. My name's Paul Ladley. I'm going to talk about gamification, although I'm going to broaden the topic actually into games-based learning, and I'll sort of define what I consider the difference between the two as we go along. Okay. I do apologise for the formatting on this. We had a bit of a problem with sort of Adobe Connect actually, so it's just flicked ahead a little bit for me there. But so I'm going to give you a brief introduction about myself first off, and then we'll go through really what is gamification. And then I think probably sort of the key thing for you guys is, why are you going to use gamification in learning? I'll cover a little bit of theory, particularly the theory that we use when we're designing sort of games-based learning products at Pixel Fountain. And then I think I'll talk you through some sort of simulation that I've done. One that's quite a complicated sort of learning simulation, which is called Planet Sustainability, which we've been using for quite a long time now. And another one, which is a very simple Excel spreadsheet-based algorithm really that we put together to link together or to gamify some activities that we did in the STEM day a few weeks back. Then I'll go through sort of making it happen, sort of thinking about yourselves, what does game-based learning mean, what, the do's and don'ts, and then I'll briefly cover sort of a games-based learning analysis and planning tool. I put that together a few years ago, and I still think it's relevant now, and that's available in the resources area. In terms of myself, I set up Pixel Fountain in 1995. I probably first got into doing games probably about 98, so so quite a long time now. We didn't really call them games at the time, as I'll sort of cover this later on. That the G word wasn't mentioned, and but we were doing sort of simulations. We were actually linked with the University of Sheffield at that time. We were doing work around sort of environmental consultancy, and we'd done sort of virtual sites. So in total, I would say in terms of what we've done a lot in learning games, we're probably over the last 15 years really, and that's been right across various sectors really. A lot of work in the sort of public sector around local authorities, but also doing corporate and education sector as well. So we worked in schools. Youngest probably the back end of primary schools we've done schools, colleges, and the HE sector as well. So doing some work recently with some undergraduates at University of Northampton. In terms of what I do, I work at all sort of stages of the sort of from consultancy right through to sort of design, development and delivery. So so I've done an awful lot of facilitation, probably 300-400 workshops actually using sort of learning simulations. And also I blog, although as I was being honest with saying to Rob earlier on, actually my daughter does most of the blogging for me actually, so so you'll get her insights as well, but that's on gamesbasedlearning.com. So okay, so what is gamification? In its loosest sense, it's sort of using game elements, themes, and also the sort of dynamics of games in non-game settings. So obviously learning, but also in other instance would be in marketing as well. At the very simplest level, just having a win or lose, that sort of game mechanics. But you can go right up then into sort of sophisticated algorithms and sort of artificial intelligence, and some of the simulation that we do sort of embed those sorts of things into them. And they're about sort of motivating people. They're about sort of encouraging people, encouraging usage, and there's many more uses. And really, I think with gamification, there's sort of there is no limit to what you can do with it. I think sometimes the case of is reining it in as well, but I'll talk about that later as well. it's not really necessarily making games. So gamification is why I differentiate between gamification and games-based learning. So gamification is sort of, it's using game-like experiences, and but that could be at a very, very simple level, could be, a leaderboard, badges, and if you think about it in terms of education, giving stars to people is a form of gamification, and and at a very, very simple level in terms of gamification that you can get on these sort of websites is that's in essence what they're doing. They're sort of creating a digital version of gold stars, but then you can get much more sort of immersive experiences. And the key issue really is that, when someone's playing, they're generating real world outcomes, which is why I think really in terms of sophistication, in terms of learning, it's games-based learning, which is really about anchoring that learning process to a game. And we'll talk a little bit more and show you a bit more of that during the course of this webinar. Again, I do apologise for my Patman sort of now eating those words. It's a sort of font issue, that. And so I mentioned motivation and engaging reluctant learners. Incredibly surprised really with how that sort of works. I was doing a workshop. This was a renewable energy game that I developed, and we're delivering it in various schools to ages. They were about sort of 14, 15-year-olds, and at the end of the session, we were sort of trying to work out who'd won, and so we were sort of like saying, okay, who scored this, and gradually we're all sort of sitting down when they hadn't got above a certain number, and then we had sort of one young lad sort of still standing at the end of the session, and there was sort of like murmurs of surprise and sort of like, how come him? And which I didn't think much of because I'd never been in this school before, and so it was only talking to this sort of teacher afterwards to find out actually this kid never really succeeded at anything, and this is the first time he'd ever sort of delivered. He didn't normally engage in the sort of classroom, and so it was at that moment really I sort of realised the sort of power of games, and I think that's really, really the key. It's how does the sort of game enhance the learning experience? How does it bring in people who are not normally engaged in that sort of learning process? I think the key aspect of how games does that is this idea of experiential learning. I mean, you've probably seen, this sort of diagram before, although I've done a sort of slightly modified version of it. This sort of Kolb's experiential learning cycle. So you've got, your concrete experience, your reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. And obviously that links to sort of Honey and Mumford's sort of learning styles of reflectors, theorists, pragmatists, and activists. And what I was doing with it really is just sort of showing how sort of games sort of fits into that. So if you now say the concrete experience is play, so they're playing a game, and then in doing that they can sort of ponder. They can ponder what's happened in that game. Why did that happen? What went wrong there? And that can be done as a sort of a group exercise as well. It doesn't have to be a sort of a solitary exercise, but they can ponder and think about what's happened. And then they can sort of piece that together. They can piece it together with their their existing knowledge. Okay, so how does that link to that? And okay, I can see that now. And that reminds me of, and you can start sort of piecing together their understanding from this sort of game experience, and ultimately then they can put that into practice. So they gain that new knowledge. So I think it's incredibly rich experience from a sort of learning theory point of view. I think it also supports sort of visual, auditory, and kinesthetics. The reason why I put a question mark there is because I'm not entirely sure that I buy into the idea that some people are visual learners and that's the only way they learn, and some people are auditory. I think from a learning design point of view, I think they're very valid in the sense that if you're going to design a piece of learning to actually say, well, it's going to encapsulate visual elements, auditory, and kinesthetic, I think that's a perfectly good idea in terms of design and engagement. I'm not sure entirely if you take it that much further in terms of it being a learning theory. Accelerated learning. I did a workshop. I did quite a lot of workshops, like I said earlier on, in local authorities. We were doing some work on waste management, and it reminded me when I was putting the slide together of an example, a conversation I was having with a learning officer. An officer in Manchester Council, and he come back to me at the end of it, and he says, in this simulation, I've learned more in 3 hours, and this was a sort of collaborative simulation that we did as a group exercise. I've learned more in 3 hours than I would have done in 3 weeks. And I think that's the power of games. They enable to bring really complex subjects together in a way that's really difficult to do in a sort of instructional sort of page flipping sort of e-learning mode. But again, what I'd say is it's horses for courses, so where those subjects are complex, games lend themselves very, very well, but some subjects are just not complicated, and I think in some sense games can be slightly over the top. One of the things that we found out very, very early on, actually, when we started doing sort of collaborative games, and I think I'm going back to sort of 2002, 2003 when we did these. We started doing them with vengeance, really. Before that, we'd been doing games that were sort of standalone, and we thought we were teaching people about things like sustainable development. And I'll show you a simulation in a moment, which was pretty much the same simulation that we delivered way back then, which just goes to show if the game's designed right, it really does have legs. We've been using the same particular simulation for 10 years now, and what we were trying to teach people around was sustainable development, and we geared this simulation up to represent what was at the time the way in which people structure around these local student partnerships, which was the idea of getting the college working with the local authority, working with the police force, and so we designed the game to sort of simulate that structure and teach people about sustainable development. What was coming back in the feedback, because we were getting huge amounts of feedback, from this, because we were sort of making the rules up as we were going along, because nobody was out there doing the same things that we were doing, and a lot of the feedback would come back saying, I've really improved my collaborative learning skills. I've understood, the strategic intent of what's happening. I understand how these things are joined up, and we suddenly realised actually we were teaching people a lot more than just sustainable development, and there was these generic skills that people were getting. And I think you need to think about that as well, really, in terms of how games can actually create a very, very rich learning experience, and don't just simply have to be, about the subject itself. Not that games that are simplified like that are not justifiable, but there is opportunity to be incredibly rich with them. This is, and I won't talk through too much on this one because it is quite a heavy slide, but I'll just alert you to the sort of thing at the bottom of the page, really, to say that this is a paper that I put together a while back, and called Games-Based Situated Learning. What I was getting at there really is I was very inspired by the work of Harrington and Oliver, and who Australian academics written an awful lot around sort of situated learning and multimedia. So this idea of a sort of constructivist learning theory, and I found this quite a good way of thinking about the sort of design process. So it's about sort of looking at authentic context, so in my simulations you try to visually make it look like the town, and you'll see that in a moment. You create authentic activities, so when the people actually going through the process of simulation, it represents what they would do in the real life. So they present information to each other, they look at reports, they make decisions, they negotiate with each other. It embeds expert performance and models processes. What we do with these simulations, we work with experts in the first instance and try and get to understand what's going on, and that's how you build that sort of simulation based upon that. I think multiple roles and perspectives incredibly important, particularly in sort of apprenticeship level, or in sort of vocational learning, where you're trying to get people to understand how a particular sort of process works. So and it also gives people to gives them a chance to sort of stand in the shoes of a particular person. And collaborative construction of knowledge, I've mentioned that already. Really, it's this idea of it's not really an instructional method. It's about sort of working together, and even in group situations, or working up understanding from doing various activities, providing coaching and scaffolding. I'm really big on this one. I think a lot of games have been basically designed by people who are at heart gamers and technologists, and they've not necessarily understood that what they're designing is a piece of learning, and that's got to be used in a very practical way in a classroom setting or in a workshop. And and you've got the opportunity there to have an educator or a facilitator who can sort of take people through that process, can help them along, can sort of work out what they're understanding, what they're not understanding, and you sort of essentially get the best of both worlds. And I would sort of argue that truly is blended learning, where you've got a sort of workshop environment and a sort of digital element sat straight in it. And I think sort of this idea of being able people to promote articulation. So in a lot of our workshops, it's all about the conversations, and I'll show you that in process in a moment. And if you want to, you can integrate assessment into a game itself as well. What you should see on the screen is, and I'm going to show you, I'll take you through this in a moment, but I'm just trying to give you a sort of picture, sort of the backstory of what planet sustainability is. It says they're used in 450 workshops. This particular simulation hasn't been used in 450 workshops, but it's the one that we've used the most of, and it's probably been 250, 300 workshops, and we've got various other simulations. That's where the 450 figure comes from. I'm banging on about this now, but it's educator led, it's facilitated. So essentially you've got a simulation which is played out in a room. You can have any. I mean, typically you want 8 people, just because in this particular simulation there's 8 teams, and but the largest number, we did a workshop with Unilever with 200 people, and we run 2 simulations side by side, which was quite an exciting process. But I would say typically you're looking at sort of 20-ish would be a typical number. The picture you can see there, the photograph is a group of young people from West Cumbria. That's their youth parliament, and they were going through this planet sustainability exercise as a way of understanding what goes on in a local council. And so I would have led that, although I actually, looking at that picture now, I was actually working with a chap called Chris Carlson from Sefton Council, and we led that together. And so you would have a laptop project on a wall, and they're working in groups. So you've got teams, so they're working with probably in that session, because I think there was about sort of 30 people in there. They're in sort of groups of 2s and 3s. Their interaction with the game is incredibly low tech. So whilst it's a very sophisticated learning simulation, the actual gaming interaction is actually quite low tech. They're making choices. It's a resource management game, and they're making choices on laminated sheets. So they literally say, I want to buy one of them, and they've just put a dot on a laminated sheet, and we can wipe it off and reuse the sheets later. And so it's incredibly low tech. The reason why we did that is because it's the learning comes first, not the technology. It's almost irrelevant, the fact that do we need them to actually input the numbers into a learning simulation? Does it help the learning? We felt not, and particularly because we were working with adult learners, and this goes back sort of 10 years when we first started doing this. You could then spend the first sort of 20 minutes explaining how the game works. When really what you should be explaining is how to learn, how to learn about the local authority. So it anchors learning conversations. So you see in that group there, you've got conversations happening, and conversation will happen at a team level. So someone will be playing the college, and they'll be talking about the decisions that they need to make in terms of college. They'll be interacting with other people in the simulation. So some people will be playing the transport, and they might have conversations around that. If you buy this, I'll buy that. To get these negotiations, this comes back to that idea of generic skills. So they're not just learning about what transport is and what sustainable transport is. They're learning about how to negotiate, how to present an argument, and then also you've got this sort of group level conversation as well. So when they've made all their choices, the data is input into the simulation, and that's done by the facilitator. And you ask sort of 2 key questions. You ask, what have you bought? And much more important, you ask why have they bought it. So this is that articulation of the subject, which Harrington is talking about, which was done on the previous slide. So it's absolutely key that you get those conversations happening. And in some ways, the educator and the facilitator really acts as a sort of a conductor in an orchestra, and as this sort of game goes on. I mean, our games, by the way, are incredibly noisy and loud, and there'll be people all over the place. So it's an awful lot of fun. And finally, that final bullet point there, which I think is really, really important, is that although we didn't do this particularly in planet sustainability, but we've done a variation recently with the University of Northampton, their undergraduates, a simulation we call Planet Housing. which is a sort of variation on the sustainable development simulation. And in that there are a couple of incidents, and what we've done is we saved the data, so they play the simulation over the course of 5 weeks, and so they play various rounds of this simulation, and then interspersed with that they're doing sort of offline activities. So I think there's a flood, and I think one of the instances is a riot. So they have to then sort of they spend a session thinking about, well, why did that riot occur? How would that riot impact on on my team? What can I do about it? And they have a group discussion about that. And they put together a sort of presentation and then come to the front of the group and then present that. And then what we're doing then is we're getting that marked by the other teams with sort of peer review. And the score that they were getting would then be inputted back into the simulation and change the dynamics of the game. So if they did a particularly good explanation and a good strategy, they would get a high score, and that would actually mean that they'd the game would slightly change for them. They would perhaps get a little bit more money. Some of their outcomes would slightly change. So you can integrate offline activities with game activities, so you can make quite a sophisticated learning experience. Like I say, that one run over sort of 5 weeks in an undergraduate module. Although we have done those offline activities in a sort of day-based workshops as well. So what we're going to do now is try and show you that in practice. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see planet sustainability. Rob, I don't know if you want to just cut in, just make sure that you can.
Yep, Paul, that's see that really clearly. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so this is planet sustainability, and so this is about that authentic content. So you can see there's a visual there. When we first did this visual, I mean, this was way back in 2001 when this was designed. We were thinking about, so we've got a little pop-up there, shouldn't be reading that. We were thinking about this in terms of you'd go into these buildings and then you would interact in them, and it was just really, in some ways, it's a menu. But then we realised that we could actually make this visual menu change. So we can make the smoke move, and you'll see various things sort of shoot through. We can football team will happen there, and the fish will appear in the river. Depending what's happened in the simulation. We did it because we could. We did it because we thought it'd be funny. We didn't realise that actually, from a learning perspective, it would have real value. So it tends to sort of really hook people into the learning process. So after you've done the sort of first round, people go, oh wow, look at that, oh that's happened, what's that? And they really engage. And we've realised from that point onwards, if you're doing a resource management game, having a graphic like this is really important, just to sort of hook people in. So in terms of how this works, essentially you've got 8 teams, I mentioned that before, and team are playing various roles in the simulation. So we've got a team that's playing third sector, a team that's playing transport, we've got a town hall, we've got utilities, we've got college, we've got housing regeneration, we've got primary care trust, and we've got the development partnership. So if I had 24 people in a workshop, there would be 3 people playing in each of those roles, and this has been played, this particular simulation, youngest group would be about 8 years old in a primary school, and the eldest would be retirees from community voluntary groups, and everywhere in between. And we've had CEOs playing it, and like I say, primary school kids playing it, and they all play it similarly and really effectively, and you don't have to change the language an awful lot when you're working with primary school kids. It turns out that actually the language doesn't really get in the way, and I know I've had various conversations with teachers on this, thinking, my kids are not going to understand that. But actually, when they're playing any games, they don't know what a phaser Zooton gun is. In some other game, what they do is they buy it, see what it does, and if they like it, they buy it again, and that's that sort of experimental way of learning. And so you play out there. So in this simulation, they've got report screens. So I'm looking, you're looking at the development partnership here, and it's showing you that at the moment competitiveness is 0. And what they're trying to do then is make investments that improve competitiveness, and if they can do that, that will increase this number of businesses, which will generate jobs. And in the primary care trust, you would have Illness has been a sort of central thing here. Is STIs. Although when we did the primary school version, we didn't call them STIs, we called it young people's issues. And then poverty, that feeds into illness, and housing and air and water quality and sort of road traffic are all feeding into illness. So it's a way of this subject's incredibly complex. It's about sustainable development, and so it's meshing together social, economic, environment, and all the different aspects of that into this sort of level of understanding, and doing it within the context of a simulation is a very powerful way of doing it. And it's just really this is a typical subject that would lend itself to this very complex, rich treatment within a gaming environment. So if I just show you the scores, this is what they're trying to achieve. I'll just let that load up. So I think there's a slight lag, so I'll just pause a little bit. So so you've got a score here, and on the left hand side it's 0.8, and we've got some objectives in the central. So we've got things on resources, things on economics. So to increase business innovation and startups, and they're trying to improve these outcomes, and in doing that, learn about sort of sustainable development. So let me show you how that works. So go back into the computer, and then we choose the purchases, and each team has got a budget, and so in this team I'm looking at the third sector, the community and voluntary sector, and they've got a whole bunch of things they can buy. So in some ways it's sort of the takeaway menu, and at the top we've got funding for young people coalition, right down to the bottom community composting, and they can choose what they want. I won't tell you too much about the sort of mechanics of how the game works, but these are the unit prices, and it tells you how many you can buy and so forth. But if I just go here and say I want Young People's Coalition, I want one of those, I'm just going to sort of randomly stab, and clearly this is not a brilliant way to play a game, but what I want to show you is, let's say that team made those decisions. They wouldn't actually import them, like I said before. They'd have mapped those up on a sheet, and they would have been having conversations amongst each other. And again, I'm just randomly stabbing in the development partnership. I'll be slightly less random in the utilities because I want to actually bring up some graphics. So I'll buy wind power. I'll buy a few of those. I'll buy as many as I can before I run out of money. And also in transport, I'll buy some trams. This has got a negative purchase here as well in terms of congestion charging, so I'll get a bit more money for that as well. So I'll do that, and in doing that, I'll then buy some buses. And these sort of ways in which I'm talking through, that's the sort of conversation that they would have in a group level. If we do this, we can do that, and that'll get us some results. And they'll have been thinking about that in terms of their report screens, and they make those choices. So they've had the conversations within the team, and they're having conversations across the team, partly because some of the purchases are represented in more than one team. So Safe Routes to School is both in the transport team, but it's also should be, I think, right there you go, it's also in the college team as well. So in that instance, they have to work together. I'll buy it this year, you buy it that year, and so forth, and they have that conversation. And so when they've actually worked out everything they're going to buy, we call them back to their seats, and we go through that process that I mentioned before. What have you bought and why have you bought it, and we input it in. So I would have been, as a facilitator, I would have done all the inputting, and then we remind them where they are at the moment. So nothing's much happening. There's quite a lot of traffic. There's lots of crime represented by the by this sort of police van here. The housing quality is very poor. There's lots of roofs with holes in. We've got big queue outside the primary care trust, and nobody's playing sport. And remind them what the score is. I think there's a little bit of a lag actually. Are you seeing the score screen? Just wait.
Hi Paul. Hi Paul. Rob. I'm still seeing the third sector purchasing screen.
Okay. You see the college one?
No, I can see that you've clicked on the status or the menu bar at the bottom. I can see you clicked on college, but it's still showing third sector for us. Yep, we're still on third sector.
Still third sector now?
Yep.
So I'm assuming that's
Yeah, it might be.
Because that was working okay for us, wasn't it, the other day?
Yeah,
So
if you want to continue with that, you can either, if you want to stop screen sharing and share it again.
okay, let me try and do that one. So stop sharing.
Yep.
Yeah. So I'll just whip back to the presentation,
Okay.
and then so we can sort of load one thing and load one thing out and see if so that's the presentation.
Okay. Yeah, that's loaded fine.
Yeah. So I go back to share my screen.
Yeah.
Share my screen, and I go to the first monitor. What you should see is the town hall coming up, but of course it might then freeze on the town hall. But
Let's have a look. Just loading now. Okay, it's still trying to load, I think. Just seeing a blank screen with your mouse.
yeah, I can't see anything on mine. Well, I mean, obviously I can see it on my screen, but I can't see it on the Adobe Connect. So try again.
Yep, yeah.
So I share a document. So
Yep, so that's the slide working, yep.
Yeah. So stop sharing, and I share my screen. And that minimizes, so it sort of seems to start and then it minimizes the process.
Okay. I think we might need to just go back to your slides then, Paul.
Yeah, reckon so. All right. Sorry about that, people. Okay, so what would happen in that situation, just to sort of cover off where we got to in that story, and I'll try and do it with my with this visual representation here. When I was actually in those screens before, and you saw report screens, you probably didn't see the fact that I was clicking on purchase screens as well, which was selecting purchases, and you know, from those you can then sort of input that into the simulation, and I do apologise. Actually, if I've got a phone going in the background, I thought I got rid of all my phones, but I didn't realise the base unit actually had the sound on it as well. So in essence, what you do is you then put those numbers in, and they're going to then change this sort of simulation. So in the first picture of that simulation, you wouldn't have seen these sort of wind turbines, and we've got some people playing sports here. Those have all basically changed because of the choices they've made in the simulation. That would also increase the score. And it would change all the report screens. So all the report screens that they had in the simulation will change. I think as well, actually, Rob, if you can remind me at the end of this simulation, what I can do is I can send you a PowerPoint presentation which does a sort of day in the life of a Planet Sustainability, and then people can sort of flick through the screens. Or also I can basically point people in the direction of a walkthrough demonstration on one of our websites, and I think that will work as well. But in general, so what's happening is that sort of resource management is changing, and they go through that process sort of three or four rounds, depending on the simulation, of sort of planning what they're going to do, looking at report screens, making some purchases, negotiating with other teams, and then inputting those, and then seeing how it goes and how it impacts on the score. And so that's incredibly sort of rich simulation. But this is a simulation. I'm not sure if I actually should try to do the screen shots on this one, but I'm wondering whether it might work because it's an Excel spreadsheet. So should we go for it? I'll talk a little bit about the background to this. This was a simulation. Say simulation. It's an Excel spreadsheet. Did it in about a day, and And but the point was that we were doing a project with the University of Chester. It's run behavioural economics and transactional analysis. It's funded through UKCES, and as part of that, we were doing a STEM day, and we were trying to think about how to encourage young people to get into the food and drink sector. And we had this idea that a sense of purpose for young people was is incredibly important. And is there any sense of purpose, of why would you want to work in the food and drink sector? So essentially what we were thinking about is here, this was the sector that feeds the world, literally feeds the world, and at a time when these young people are going to be by 2050 there's going to be 9 billion of them, whilst climate change kicking in. So so this was the idea: come up with a new food product and to change the world in essence. And so we had 4 activities, and these were all sort of paper-based activities, group work with flip charts. They had to come up with an innovative idea. They had to think about how to market that. So we did sort of something around the 4 Ps, sort of price, product, promotion and place. We looked at sustainability, so sort of social, economic and environmental aspects. And then we also did this sort of sensory thing. So we had them sort of tasting various sorts of Coca-Colas and lemons and limes and crunchy stuff. And but each one of the activities was marked, so they had a score. And those were sort of inputted into this spreadsheet, and that would generate some budget. So the better they performed in these activities, the more money they would have to choose to buy the purchases. So so they've got the money, but then they also did a presentation. It's sort of Dragon Den sort of style, really, where they presented their sort of great new idea, and also we were marking the presentation, so it's not only the idea but how they presented the idea. And so that was scored as well, and those values were also put into the spreadsheet, and from that we essentially generate a number, which in that instance was how much they'd made. So I'm just going to see if I can get this one working. So let me see if we can get the technology working for us. All right, so share my screen, share. So this time, nope, that one's died as well. So I'll tell you what I'm going to do is I'm just going to shut down a few things. Just one last thing on this one. I'll shut down a few stuff on my desktop, and just in case there's any sort of interaction with other programs. So just come back out. So you should be back at the presentation now. So I'm just going to go and try and go back into the spreadsheet and see if that works. And other than that, I'll just talk over it. If it doesn't, won't go.
I don't think that's going to load, Paul.
No, it's failed. Yep. Okay. So just let me bring the presentation back up, and we'll talk it through. and put into the simulation, put into the spreadsheet, and it would go from one cell to the next, and ultimately that would generate the numbers that had actually been sold and how much money they'd made. So one of the other things they could do would choose the price for it, so you'd have the units that they'd sold. So if they'd sold 700,000 at £1.50, that would generate the sort of total amount of money in their profit. And then we gave prizes. So the prizes were, each of the activities was scored. So there was a box of chocolates for each activity, and then the big prize was each member of the team got £10 tokens for the local cinema, and then we also, because it was sort of the idea of sustainability and sort of creating new foods, what we also did was did a £100 donation to a charity, and it was round about Red Nose Day. So we offered it to Red Nose Day or a local food bank, or an Oxfam one for a goat couple and water for 50 people, which I was quite pleased they chose the goat couple and the water for 50 people. So what I'm trying to get out there really is that this was a whole day activity, but the whole thing was gamified, and it was basically a set of activities, and the game itself was just really generated through some simple equations on an Excel spreadsheet. So don't think that you have to have the sort of skills to develop a really exotic learning simulation. You can do it in Excel, and it took me a day, and I didn't particularly know how to do conditional formatting, so I was teaching myself some parts of Excel that I'd never done before as well. So I would say go for that. So okay, in terms of sort of making it happen and sort of level up, don't know if you saw that animation, but I'm just tempted to. Okay, so I mentioned this right early on in terms of the game-based learning manifesto, and I said, use the G word sparingly. I think you can get away with it now, but you guys are probably really excited about it in terms of how to use it, but you can sometimes get a little bit ahead of yourself and not realize that other people just think it's like it's just having fun. It doesn't really have a learning validity. So in some ways the G word gets in the way, and in some ways thinking about it as a simulation is much more interesting, or thinking about it as a experiential activity. But who knows, you might be able to use the G word. It just might be a hangover from the fact that I was doing it 10 years ago when you couldn't use it. Don't sell the sizzle, sell the why. You really need to think about what inspired us to do this sort of learning approach. Tell the story about why you think games are important. What is this game about? What has it done? How have you seen other people use it? Use these sorts of games. Sort of share experience, and I think that's really key. I've said this several times now, and I really believe it. Learning design trumps game gimmicks. I don't really care whether a game has a virtual reality helmet and a 3D environment and it's incredibly sophisticated. If it isn't good learning, it isn't good learning, and throwing loads of bells and whistles from a game at it isn't going to help. It's the learning design that comes first. You think about what you're trying to achieve, what's the learning outcome, and if a game is the suitable way to achieve those outcomes, use a game. Real enough, not really boring. In our simulations, we talk about it as a simplification. Trying to make something absolutely accurate makes it really boring. And we've chosen really complex stories, really complex subjects, but the sort of story arc is quite simple. So you start off with a really terrible sort of community, and over the course of 4 rounds, which is a few hours worth of play, suddenly this place is all booming and all singing and dancing. That story arc makes it engaging, and whilst it might not be incredibly realistic, it's authentic enough, so you get the authentic context. The activities are authentic enough to be engaging without actually trying to be sort of desperately so real that the whole thing becomes incredibly boring. Don't crowbar games in, or gamification to the solution. People want to do it. They want to do it because they've got the technology and they just push it in all the time. But the reality is games are game changers. We've seen this time and time again. I talked about the example of accelerated learning. I talked about the idea of reluctant learners, and you can do amazing things with games. And you probably got this by now, really, in terms of the presentation. Games-based learning and gamification aren't the same thing. And they're obviously overlapping, but I would say games-based learning, if you've got a sophisticated subject, it probably lends itself to games-based learning. If you're trying to sort of engage people in a subject that's not as complex, then gamification is possibly the way forward as well. Again, it's about thinking about the learning outcomes first and then the games second. Glammed up quizzes aren't really games. I think there's a validity, by the way, to drilling, and I think websites like Mathletics and all those things are really, really powerful, but they're just not necessarily games. Having a game that just says at the back end of it, you've won, isn't games-based learning. It's possibly gamification, and has a validity. But I think that quite often people's design is limited by the fact that they say I want a game, and in the end they just produce a quiz. Fads can become mainstream. I think I think games-based learning will hit the mainstream, but I think it's incumbent on a lot of designers and learning designers to actually start using the technology as appropriately as they possibly can. This is a sort of an overview of an Allison planning tool, and again, this is in the resources section of the Learning Futures site. So I think what's key about this is I was starting to think about people in the real world of education, how they actually try and think about introducing games-based learning. So first off, it's about design. So is the game fit for purpose? Is it relevant? Is it just a game? Are you just having some fun, or is it relevant to the actual subject you're looking at? What is the context of the game? That context can be incredibly important. If you're using a commercial game and that game might be somewhat inappropriate. If not, it might be incredibly fun. I mean, the game I play the most really is Grand Theft Auto. I'm not entirely sure you could use that in education, but albeit it's a great game. Think about the activities, think about how they sort of interact and enhance the learning. Is the game pitched at the right level? I think that's really, really important as well, in terms of complexity, in terms of age. Does the game support multiple learning styles? I talked about that earlier on, but I think quite often people don't think about that. When you're talking about sort of delivery, does it work in typical educational settings? I think there was a real buzz about the Nintendo's Wii a few years ago, and and things like the Kinect. But the challenge is if you've got a room set up to do one thing, then to suddenly have people sort of flinging Wii remotes around, it makes it challenging. And so you just sort of simply, just very, very simply think about that. Is the game going to be collaborative? Does it support conversations? Is it teacher led? If are we talking about evolution or revolution? I would rather talk about the evolution of teaching rather than the revolution. We're not going to replace 150 years of high quality education by just throwing a game at it. So can the game work with teachers and so forth? I think that's incredibly important. Does it fit into a standard lesson? I think we had a big problem with this actually with ours, because ours were geared around workshops that we were doing in vocational training, which were sort of like lasting 3 or 4 hours, and how could you get that into the format of actually a sort of double lesson? And we found actually it wasn't really about it was about sort of reducing the choices in the simulation, so you didn't have as much things that you could buy, not because they couldn't cope. It was just that the more things people can buy, the longer they take to actually make those decisions. So simplifying the game in terms of its decision making speeds it up. So that was a sort of a key thing that we worked out. You need to think about the technology and support, particularly if you're going to get some sort of exotic technology. But like I said, I mean, I've shown you an example really in terms of an Excel spreadsheet gamified. It doesn't really have to be an exotic process. And outcomes, I think I've talked about that an awful a lot during this presentation, but games need to reach the part traditional teaching doesn't, and if it doesn't do that, then why would you use a game? Use it for a purpose, and I think games need to offer value for money, and but I think there's a lot of hidden costs as well. So if you're buying commercial games and you have to sort of like license them, and then if your graphic card isn't up to scratch, so before you know it, it becomes incredibly expensive. This is why I think if you're going for bespoke products that have been designed for learning in mind, you're less likely to run into those problems. The stuff that I've developed was is developed in actually that simulation there that you saw, you actually didn't see, was developed in Flash, so it's it just works in a browser. It's not particularly complicated. Now we're developing HTML5, so it sort of sits on sort of Apple products as well, and then I think ultimately you've got to think about what's your budget? You know, and if you haven't got very much money, you can do amazing things with Excel. Yeah, and if there's one thing you know, you take away from this webinar really is that, you know, you can create simple gamified experiences for very, very little money. It just needs a bit of imagination really, and I think that's really the sort of key to getting the power out of games. Game over, or is it?
Paul, thank you. First of all, as I say, thank you for your input today. I think some of those key messages about learning design, I think your analysis and planning tool is really helpful. But also thank you for overcoming the barriers of technology and sticking with it. So on behalf of everybody, I'd just like to thank Paul for his time. Just before Paul leaves us, if there's any questions that anybody has that they want to put to Paul, then please use the chat here in the bottom right hand corner. But we've got a couple of minutes, and then I'm just going to run you quickly through the resources and the CPD activity before we finish. So if there are any questions, then please do put them in there, but I'm going to have a go at sharing my screen and see how I get on. Okay, so I'm going to just take you through that we've three-stage process to the CPD modules, and as I say, I'd like to thank Paul for his input. You'll be sent a copy of that recording, but I'm just going to take you to the CPD area of the Learning Future site, and what I'm going to do, that loads on your screen, I'm just going to scroll down to the gamification module. So you should see that that's scrolling down on your screen, and I'm going to load that module, and that shows us the three stages that we spoke about. That we've got the expert input with regards to the webinar, but I'm just going to show you quickly the resources that have been put together. So these resources, we've had a look online about what sort of things go more subject and really start to get your teeth into it. Paul's whet your appetite and given some really good guidance about looking at learning design and about how important the learning is within the games-based learning. So I'm just going to load these resources. They're here for you to use, and you can see on here, I'm just going to scroll through some of these. There's a series of top 10 tips, there's a series of videos that you can see, there's some reports, some examples and case studies that you're able to use. But what we've done, as I say, is gone through what sort of resources could you access online. Now, to help that a little bit further, what we've then done is put together a CPD activity. Just before I come off the Learning Future site, if I just load the useful resources section, there we go, the gamification resources to support the webinar. There's the two resources on there that you can see. Download those two documents that Paul mentioned in his presentation. So let me just bring you back into the CPD activity. Let's just do that. Okay. So what I'm going to do is just load this activity. Okay. Let's have a look. Okay. Let me just go back to our CPD section, and I'm just going to load it right from there. Okay, as I say, the aim of the CPD activity then, that should come up on your screen in a second. It's just downloading. And so the idea of the CPD activity is there for you to be able to dip into. We don't recommend that you start it activity A and work your way through there. But so, for example, if you're saying, I need to communicate with my colleagues, is gamification, then we'd suggest that you have a look through the research, and the video suggested that you have a look at is shown there. We put 30 little green circles just to indicate the type of time that it might take, so about 30 minutes within there. But this is the sort of thing that if you just want to be able to give a quick definition to somebody, what is gamification, that's the sort of activity that we would recommend you look at. We've got a clear understanding of gamification. We'd move some examples of how gamification is reshaping learning, and there's some examples there. There's some further examples where you might start to look at how that affects your current learning and where that future of learning might be going. Again, some case studies and some consideration about the impact of gamification as well. So those activities are there to help you take this information and apply back into your own place. To our slides. Okay, just whilst that's loading, I'm just picking up your comments in the chat area as well. Paul, thank you for that confirming. Joe, I know that you were keen on having a look at that spreadsheet. So as we close, do feel free to continue to use the chat area, but just to remind you, if there's been something that's been of use within the webinar content, within the resources and within the CPD activities, we'd welcome you to use that and share and give us some feedback with regards to that. If you'd like to use the Learning Futures site, you'll be able to either put a blog entry yourself or share a resource on the useful resources section. And if you found that useful, then please feel free to access any of the other modules. As I mentioned at the start, some of them are recorded already, others are yet to happen, and you'll be able to keep an eye on when those dates are coming up. But if there's anything else, Joe, yeah, we can sort that out. I'm just looking at your comments with regards to adding resources to the CPD area. Yeah, we can sort that out, no problem at all. But unless there's any other questions that are coming up, again, just like to thank Paul for his time and his really useful input with regards to gamification. We hope that you found that useful, and we look forward to seeing you in the next webinar.